Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and James Hillman, the poet of the imaginal underworld. Together and apart, they charted the territories where mythology meets psychology, where soul refuses to be contained by a single vision. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the nature of psyche and soul. One seeing an integrated journey toward wholeness through the self, the other discovering a multiplicity of voices, a polytheistic parliament of images that resists any final unity. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Hillman as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. Let us begin where all psychological stories must begin, in the personal histories that shape how thinkers come to see the invisible territories of mind and soul. Carl Gustav Jung, born in 1875 in the Swiss countryside, grew up in a world where the rational and the numinous existed in uneasy proximity. His father was a Protestant pastor whose faith had grown hollow and performative, a man who believed because he must, not because he felt the living presence of the divine. His mother was a figure of psychological complexity, sometimes the conventional parson's wife, sometimes a woman who spoke with an uncanny wisdom that seemed to come from depths beyond the ordinary personality. Jung learned early that people contain multiplicities, that beneath the social surface lie other personalities, other voices. As a young psychiatrist at the Berg-Holzli Hospital in Zurich at the turn of the 20th century, Jung encountered madness not as mere disease, but as a meaningful eruption of symbolic material. Where others saw only symptoms to be catalogued and suppressed, Jung perceived patterns, narratives, mythological themes. He developed the word association test, mapping the complex for those feeling-toned clusters of ideas that operate with a certain autonomy within the psyche. Already, he was learning to listen for what speaks through us rather than simply from us. His collaboration and subsequent break with Sigmund Freud marked Jung's passage into his own psychological territory. Freud's emphasis on sexuality as the primary drive, his reduction of symbols to disguised wishes, his insistence on the personal unconscious, all of this felt incomplete to Jung. During his confrontation with the unconscious, that dangerous period from 1913 to 1919, when Jung deliberately engaged the figures and visions arising from his own depths, he discovered what he would come to call the collective unconscious. This was not just the repository of personal forgotten memories, but a deeper stratum containing universal patterns, archetypal images, primordial forms that structured human experience across cultures and epochs. Jung emerged from this dark night of the soul with a vision of the psyche as vast, purposive, and fundamentally oriented toward wholeness. The self, capital S, became his central organizing concept, the archetype of totality, the goal of the individuation process. that lifelong journey toward becoming more fully who one truly is. For Jung, the self was both center and circumference, the organizing principle that could bring the warring factions of the psyche, ego, and shadow, persona and anima, conscious and unconscious, into a dynamic equilibrium. This was not a static perfection, but an ongoing dialectic, a conversation between opposites that produces a third thing, the transcendent function, the symbol that unites what seemed irreconcilable. By the time Jung was establishing his analytical psychology in the 1920s and 30s, he was also developing his understanding of synchronicity, the collective unconscious, the process of active imagination, and the central importance of myth and religion as expressions of archetypal realities. He saw himself as a bridge builder, creating connections between psychology and spirituality, between individual experience and universal patterns, between the modern rational mind and the ancient wisdom traditions. His writing took on an integrative quality, always seeking to show how the many relates to the one, how diverse symbols point toward common archetypal structures, how personal suffering connects to collective patterns. Jung's relationship to images was fundamentally interpretive. When a patient brought a dream, Jung would amplify it, connecting the personal image to its mythological and alchemical parallels, showing how this particular dream related to universal themes. The image was important, yes, but it was also a doorway to something beyond itself, to the archetype, to the self, to the individuation process. This hermeneutic approach, this constant translation of image into meaning and meaning into developmental narrative, characterized Jung's mature work. Now, let us turn to the other figure in tonight's conversation. Born into a different world yet drawn to similar questions, James Hillman entered the world on April 12, 1926, in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He came of age during the Second World War, that cataclysm that shattered the optimistic progressivism of the modern age and revealed depths of human darkness that demanded psychological understanding. After serving in the Navy Hospital Corps, Hillman pursued his education with an intensity that spoke to a soul hungry for meaning. He studied at the Sorbonne, at Trinity College Dublin, and eventually at the University of Zurich, where he trained as a Jungian analyst at the Jung Institute. This is crucial to understand. Hillman was trained in the very tradition he would later critique and transform. He was not an outsider attacking Jung from a position of ignorance, but a son rebelling against a father he knew intimately. He completed his training analysis, practiced as a Jungian analyst, and even served as the director of studies at the Jung Institute from 1959 to 1969. During these years, he was immersed in Jungian thought, teaching it, embodying it, living within its conceptual framework. But something in Hillman chafed against certain tendencies he observed in orthodox Jungian practice. He noticed how quickly practitioners moved from image to interpretation, from the particular dream figure to the general archetype, from the soul's actual presentation to the analyst's theoretical framework. He watched as patients' dreams were mined for evidence of individuation, as if the psyche existed primarily to confirm Jung's developmental narrative. He felt an increasing unease with the way Jungian psychology, despite its richness, still maintained a monotheistic bias toward unity, toward the self as supreme organizing principle, toward wholeness as the ultimate goal. Hillman's rebellion took shape gradually, through a series of texts that began to articulate a different vision. His early work, Suicide and the Soul, published in 1964, already showed his distinctive approach, a willingness to stay with the darkest images, to resist the therapeutic, impulse to fix or heal too quickly, to honor the soul's descent as meaningful in itself rather than merely a prelude to ascent. But it was in the 1970s that Hillman's archetypal psychology emerged fully formed, particularly in his magnum opus Revisioning Psychology, published in 1975. This book announced a revolution within the Jungian tradition, a reimagining so radical that it questioned the very foundations Jung had laid. Hillman proposed what he called archetypal psychology, distinguishing it carefully from Jungian analytical psychology. Where Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, Hillman preferred the term psychic reality or imaginal realm. Where Jung emphasized integration and wholeness, Hillman championed multiplicity and polytheism. Where Jung saw the self as the ultimate archetype, Hillman insisted on sticking with the image, resisting the move toward any supreme organizing principle. The philosophical backdrop to Hillman's thought included not just Jung but also Neoplatonism, particularly Plotinus and the later Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino. From these sources, Hillman drew the concept of the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, a realm neither purely material nor purely spiritual, but an autonomous dimension where images have their own reality and vitality. This was not Jung's collective unconscious, which was still conceived somewhat scientifically as a layer of the psyche. For Hillman, the imaginal was more ontologically real, more like a place one could visit through the practice of soul-making. Hillman also drew deeply on Greek mythology, but in a way distinct from Jung's approach. Where Jung used myth to illustrate archetypal processes, seeing specific gods as embodiments of general archetypes, Hillman insisted on the irreducible particularity of each mythic figure. Aphrodite was not simply an embodiment of the love archetype, but a specific perspective, a unique way of being in the world, with her own values, her own mode of consciousness, her own legitimate claims. To collapse her into a general category was to lose the precision, the flavor, the actual psychological reality she offered. The historical context of the 1960s and 70s also shaped Hillman's vision. This was an era of deconstruction, of challenging unitary narratives, of embracing plurality and difference. The counterculture questioned the dominant cultural narrative of progress and unity. Feminism challenged patriarchal monotheisms. Postmodern philosophy, especially in its French variants, was beginning to critique grand unified theories and celebrate multiplicity, difference, and the irreducibility of the particular. Hillman's polytheistic psychology emerged from this cultural moment, bringing its spirit into the heart of Jungian discourse. By the time Hillman left the Jung Institute and moved to the United States, establishing himself first in Dallas and later in Connecticut, he had become the most important voice in what was now called archetypal psychology or post-Jungian psychology. His work influenced not just clinicians, but also scholars in religious studies, literature, philosophy, and cultural criticism. He wrote prolifically books on dreams, on character, on aging, on war, on politics, always bringing his imaginal approach, his commitment to staying with the image, his resistance to reductive interpretation. The relationship between Jung and Hillman, then, is not one of simple opposition. It is more like the relationship between a musical tradition and a revolutionary composer who emerges from within that tradition to push it toward possibilities the founders never imagined. Hillman never rejected Jung entirely. He saw himself as radicalizing certain Jungian insights while critiquing others. He took Jung's attention to image and myth even further, removing the developmental framework that Jung had retained. He took Jung's notion of the autonomous, complex, and extended it into a full polytheistic vision of psyche. He honored Jung's move beyond Freudian reductionism, while pointing out that Jung had not gone far enough, that he had retained a covert Christianity, a covert monotheism, in his emphasis on the self and wholeness. Jung. Had he lived to read Hillman's mature work, Jung died in 1961, just as Hillman was beginning to articulate his distinct vision, might have been both fascinated and troubled. Fascinated because here was someone taking imaginal reality with utter seriousness, refusing easy consolations, honoring the darkness and complexity of psychic life. Troubled because Hillman seemed to reject what Jung considered the telos of psychological life, the movement toward the self, the possibility of relative wholeness and integration. For Jung, multiplicity without the self risked fragmentation, risked the very schizophrenia he had observed and personally confronted during his own descent. For Hillman, the self as supreme organizing principle risked a subtle authoritarianism, a psychic monotheism that silenced the legitimate voices of other archetypal perspectives. This is the tension at the heart of tonight's conversation. Both men were drawn to the imaginal realm, to mythology, to the autonomy of psychic figures. Both rejected the reductionism of mainstream psychology. Both saw therapy as fundamentally about soul, about meaning, about the recovery of depth in a flattened culture. Yet they diverged fundamentally on the question of unity versus multiplicity, integration versus polytheism, the self versus the irreducible plurality of archetypal perspectives. This divergence was not trivial. It represented two different visions of what the psyche is and what psychological health might mean. As we prepare to explore their ideas in detail, consider the stakes of this dialogue. If Jung is right, then Hillman's polytheistic psychology risks leaving the ego overwhelmed by autonomous forces, with no centering principle, no possibility of achieving relative wholeness. If Hillman is right, then Jung's emphasis on the self imposes a false unity, a premature closure, a monotheistic bias that does violence to the legitimate multiplicity of the soul. Or perhaps, and this is what we will explore as the night deepens, both are right in their own registers, describing different aspects of psychic reality, different needs of the soul at different moments. Let us now descend more deeply into the specifics of their visions, beginning with their different relationships to the central concept that animated both their work, the archetype. For Jung, the archetype was one of his most important discoveries, perhaps the cornerstone of his entire psychological edifice. He distinguished between the archetype as such, the unrepresentable formal structure, the empty pattern, and the archetypal image, the specific manifestation of that pattern in dream, myth, art, or vision. The archetype, as such, belongs to the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of the psyche that contains inherited potentials for representing experience. The archetypal image is what appears to consciousness, shaped by personal and cultural factors, but pointing toward the universal pattern beneath. Jung observed that certain themes, figures, and narratives appeared across cultures and epochs with striking similarity. The Great Mother, the wise old man, the divine child, the hero's journey, the dragon to be slain, the treasure to be won. These recurring patterns suggested to Jung that human beings inherit not specific memories, but predispositions to form certain types of images, certain narrative structures. Just as we inherit the structure of the body, 2 eyes, 1 heart, opposable thumbs, so we inherit structures of imagination and meaning-making. This was, for Jung, a bridge between biology and meaning, between evolution and spirituality. The archetypes evolved because they served adaptive functions. The mother archetype, for instance, relates to the primal importance of the mother-infant bond for survival. But archetypes are not merely biological. They are also spiritual and psychological, carrying numinous power, evoking awe and fascination. When an archetype is activated, it seizes consciousness with an energy and meaning that goes beyond the ordinary. This is the basis of religious experience, of falling in love, of artistic inspiration, of psychological crisis. For Jung, archetypes are fundamentally structuring patterns. They organize experience, providing frameworks of meaning. The hero archetype, for instance, structures certain narratives of development, leaving home, facing trials, achieving a goal, returning transformed. When someone is in the grip of the hero archetype, their life takes on this shape, and their dreams may spontaneously produce images of battles, quests, and adversaries. The archetype is both a pattern of behavior and a pattern of imagination, the two being inseparable. Crucially, Jung saw the archetypes as existing in relationship to each other within a hierarchical structure, with the self at the apex. The self was the archetype of archetypes, the supreme organizing principle, the image of totality. All other archetypes, anima and animus, shadow and persona, senex and puer, existed in relation to the self and found their proper place in the individuation process, that journey toward wholeness. The self appeared in dreams and visions as mandalas, as wise figures, as divine children, as symbols of quaternity and wholeness. Its purpose was to integrate the disparate elements of the psyche, to bring consciousness and unconscious into a fruitful dialogue, to achieve relative wholeness while honoring the tension of opposites. Jung's method with archetypal images was amplification. When a patient brought a dream image, say, a black dog appearing at a crossroads, Jung would explore what the figure of the dog meant personally for this dreamer, but he would also expand outward to mythological, folkloric, and alchemical associations with dogs. In Greek mythology, Cerberus guards the underworld. In Egyptian myth, Anubis guides souls. In alchemy, the dog sometimes represents the prima materia, the raw material of transformation. Through this amplification, the personal image connected to universal meanings, and the dreamer could see how their particular experience participated in archetypal patterns. This interpretive move always aimed at serving the individuation process. The dream was understood as compensation or commentary from the unconscious, offering what consciousness lacks, correcting one-sidedness, pointing toward the next step in development. The black dog at the crossroads might represent the shadow, those disowned aspects of personality appearing at a moment of decision, suggesting that wholeness requires acknowledging what has been rejected. Or it might represent the animal, instinct that needs to be consulted before taking a new direction. The interpretation aimed to help the individual integrate the message, to move forward on the path toward greater wholeness. Now, listen carefully to how Hillman reimagined the archetype, because this is where his divergence from Jung becomes most clear and consequential. Hillman accepted the reality of archetypal images and their autonomy, but he radically rethought what an archetype is and how we should relate to it. For Hillman, the archetype is not primarily a structure or pattern, but a perspective, a style of consciousness, a way of seeing and being in the world. Each archetypal figure, Athena, Dionysus, Hades, Aphrodite, represents a distinct mode of psychological reality, with its own values, its own aesthetics, its own truth. This shift from structure to perspective is subtle but profound. A structure implies something stable and defining, something that shapes from beneath or behind. A perspective is something you can inhabit, move through, see from. When Hillman spoke of seeing through or seeing into, he meant adopting the perspective of a particular archetypal figure, allowing it to reveal its world. To see from Aphrodite's perspective is to value beauty, relationship, aesthetic harmony, and erotic connection in a way that might look foolish or dangerous from Apollo's perspective of clarity and distance. To see from Hades' perspective is to value depth, interiority, and the riches of the underworld in a way that looks like depression from a heroic or solar viewpoint. Hillman's most important move was to insist on sticking with the image. This became the methodological cornerstone of archetypal psychology. Instead of amplifying the image outward to its mythological parallels and then interpreting its meaning for individuation, Hillman proposed staying with the image as it presents itself, allowing it to reveal itself on its own terms, in its own language. The black dog at the crossroads is first and foremost a black dog at a crossroads. What is the quality of its blackness? What is the specific character of its dogness? What does this particular crossroads look like, feel like? What is the image doing, wanting, revealing? This approach required a kind of phenomenological patience, a willingness to let the image be itself without rushing to translate it into psychological or personal meaning. Hillman drew on a Neoplatonic understanding in which images are not mere representations of something else, but presences in their own right. An image is not a sign pointing beyond itself, but an epiphany, a showing forth of an aspect of psychic reality. To interpret it too quickly, to translate it into ego, language, or developmental stages, is to miss the image itself, to lose contact with the specific quality of soul it embodies. For Hillman, archetypes are irreducibly multiple and non-hierarchical. There is no self standing above and organizing all the other archetypes. Instead, there is a polytheistic parliament of perspectives, each with its own legitimacy, each making its own claims. The psyche is more like ancient Athens, a city of many temples, each dedicated to a different god, with citizens moving between these temples depending on the occasion, than like a monotheistic cathedral organized around a single altar. Psychological health, in this view, is not about integration under a single organizing principle, but about honoring the multiplicity of voices, allowing different archetypal perspectives their due, developing a kind of fluidity and moving between them. This polytheistic psychology had radical implications for how Hillman understood pathology. Where Jung saw symptoms as calls toward the self, compensations designed to correct one-sidedness and promote wholeness, Hillman saw symptoms as the voice of a neglected archetypal perspective, a god or goddess demanding recognition. Depression, for instance, was not primarily a state to be overcome on the path to individuation, but the characteristic perspective of Hades, an invitation into depth, interiority, and underworld values. To pathologize depression as merely negative was to reject the gifts of the underworld, to remain trapped in a heroic, solar consciousness that values only upward movement and achievement. Similarly, anxiety might be understood as Athena's strategic intelligence in overdrive, obsessive love as Aphrodite's possession, righteous anger as Artemis defending her boundaries. Each symptom was an archetypal perspective seeking expression, and the therapeutic task was not to integrate these perspectives under the self, but to recognize them, give them their due, and learn to live with the conflicts between them. There was no expectation of final harmony, no possibility of the ego achieving a stable relationship with a centering self. Instead, there was the ongoing, never-finished work of soul-making, the practice of deepening, relationship with the imaginal figures who constitute psychic life. Hillman's critique of Jung's individuation process was profound. He argued that Jung's emphasis on the self and on wholeness as a goal retained a covert Christianity, a monotheistic bias that did not fully honor the multiplicity of the psyche. The self, Hillman suggested, was Jung's way of smuggling God back into psychology, creating a supreme principle that ordered everything else. This gave patients a false hope of unity, a false sense that if they just did enough analysis, worked enough with their dreams, practiced enough active imagination, they could achieve a stable wholeness. In Hillman's view, this was both psychologically inaccurate and spiritually dishonest. The psyche is not whole and does not want to be. It wants to be deeply itself, which means honoring its conflicts, its contradictions, its multiple voices. The individuation process, as Jung conceived it, was also too developmental, too linear for Hillman. It implied a progression from fragmentation toward wholeness, from unconsciousness toward consciousness, from identification with complexes toward relationship with the self. This developmental narrative, Hillman argued, was another echo of Christianity's redemption narrative and modernity's progress narrative. It did not honor the cyclical nature of psychic life, the necessity of repeated descents, the value of remaining in confusion, darkness, or multiplicity. Soul-making, Hillman's alternative, was not a process with a goal, but an ongoing practice of deepening relationship with images, a continuous descent into and through imagination. Consider how differently Jung and Hillman would approach the same dream. A woman dreams she is in a large mansion with many rooms. In one room, she finds a beautiful garden. In another, a library with ancient books. In a dark basement, she encounters a chained figure who looks at her with pleading eyes. In the attic, she finds an old woman spinning thread. Jung, presented with this dream, would likely begin by exploring the personal associations. What does a mansion mean to this dreamer? What is her relationship to gardens, books, darkness, captivity? Then he would amplify the images mythologically. The mansion itself might represent the self, the totality of the psyche with its many aspects. The garden could be the paradise, or temenos, the sacred enclosed space where transformation occurs. The library suggests the wisdom of the collective unconscious, knowledge that needs to be recovered. The chained figure in the basement is clearly the shadow, the repressed and rejected aspects of personality that plead for recognition and integration. The old woman in the attic is the wise old woman archetype, perhaps the anima in her crone aspect, engaged in the work of weaving fate, of giving shape to life. Jung's interpretation would aim at showing the dreamer where she is in the individuation process. Perhaps she has been too, identified with her intellectual side, spending time in the library, but neglecting the garden of eros and relationship. Perhaps she has refused to descend into the basement to confront and integrate her shadow. The old woman spinning in the attic might represent the self's organizing activity, the wisdom that weaves all these aspects together, waiting for the dreamer to climb high enough to meet her. The dream would be understood as compensatory, showing what consciousness lacks, pointing toward the next developmental step. Jung would invite the dreamer to descend to the basement, to dialogue with the chained figure through active imagination, to gradually integrate what has been locked away, thereby moving toward greater wholeness. Hillman, approached by the same dreamer with the same dream, would resist this interpretive movement. He would first ask the dreamer to stay with each image phenomenologically. What is the quality of the light in the garden? What does it feel like to be in that space? Don't tell me what gardens mean. Tell me about this garden, its specific character. When you encounter the chained figure in the basement, what is the quality of darkness there? What is the figure's face like? What happens in your body when you meet those pleading eyes? What does the figure actually want? Not what should it want, according to theory. Hillman would resist calling the chained figure the shadow, because that label, that concept, comes between the dreamer and the actual image. It translates the specificity of this chained figure into a general category, and in doing so, loses the precise quality of soul this particular figure carries. Maybe this figure is Prometheus chained, suffering for having brought fire, light, creative power, or maybe it is Persephone before her abduction, representing an innocent aspect that needs to be taken into the underworld for soul-making to occur. Or maybe it is something unique to this dreamer's psychic reality, irreducible to mythological parallels. The goal of Hillman's approach would not be integration, but relationship, not development, but deepening. He would invite the dreamer to visit these rooms repeatedly, not to empty them of their images by integrating them into consciousness, but to develop ongoing relationship with each image on its own terms. The garden is a place to visit, a perspective to inhabit, revealing certain truths about beauty, growth, and enclosure. The library is another perspective, offering different truths about knowledge, tradition, and study. The basement, with the chained figure, is an underworld perspective, and the point is not to free the figure, not to bring it up into the light of consciousness, but to visit it in the darkness, to learn what it knows, to allow it to change one's perspective. The old woman spinning in the attic might be Moira or Clotho, the fate spinner, and the task is not to become her or to integrate her wisdom, but to recognize that fate is being, woven, that our lives are threads in a larger tapestry, and to see from her perspective how things that seem separate are connected, how the pattern emerges over time. Each room in the mansion represents a legitimate archetypal perspective, and the mansion itself is not the self unifying everything, but simply the container of multiplicity, the psyche as plural, as many-roomed. This difference in approach might seem merely methodological, but it reflects a deep philosophical divergence about the nature of psyche and the meaning of psychological work. For Jung, the psyche is ultimately oriented toward wholeness, and the unconscious, though it can be destructive when ignored, is fundamentally purposive, guiding the individual toward the self. There is a teleology to psychic life, a hidden meaning, a goal. The self is real, not just as another archetype among others, but as the organizing center, the image of God within, the supreme authority that can adjudicate between conflicting archetypal demands. For Hillman, any talk of the psyche being oriented toward anything, any suggestion of purpose or goal, imposes a meaning that comes from outside the image itself. The psyche does not want wholeness. Consciousness wants wholeness because it cannot tolerate multiplicity, cannot bear the conflict of competing voices. The self is a beautiful and powerful archetype, yes, but it is not supreme. It is one perspective among others, the perspective that values unity, symmetry, totality. From other archetypal perspectives, the self's claims to supreme authority look like psychological imperialism. Dionysus laughs at the self's pretensions to order. Aphrodite finds them aesthetically unappealing. Ares finds them weak and over-controlled. This brings us to what might be the deepest divergence between Jung and Hillman, their understanding of the relationship between psyche and spirit. Jung, though he distanced himself from conventional Christianity, retained a fundamentally spiritual orientation. His psychology was always secretly a theology, an attempt to understand the God image within the psyche, to trace the movements of the numinous in dreams and visions and symptoms. The self was the psychological name for God, the God image, and individuation was the psychological name for the spiritual journey toward union with the divine. Jung could speak of archetypes in scientific language, but he experienced them as noumena, as carriers of spiritual power. His autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, written late in life, makes clear that Jung saw his psychological work as continuous with the great spiritual traditions. His fascination with alchemy was driven by the recognition that the alchemists were describing individuation in symbolic language, the transformation of the prima materia of the unconscious psyche into the gold of the realized self. His interest in Gnosticism, in Eastern religions, in Meister Eckhart and Christian mysticism, all of this pointed toward Jung's conviction that psychology and spirituality were addressing the same reality from different angles. The self, for Jung, was experienced as transcendent, as having an authority that went beyond the ego's preferences or the culture's values. When the self spoke through dreams or visions, it carried an imperative quality, a sense of rightness and necessity that demanded obedience. The individuation process required sacrifice of ego ambitions, of comfortable identifications, of one-sided attitudes because the self demanded it. This was not arbitrary. The self knew better than ego what the whole person needed, and psychological health required submitting to this higher wisdom. Hillman profoundly distrusted this move. He saw in Jung's elevation of the self a return to the very monotheism that Jung had supposedly moved beyond. The self became a kind of internal pope, claiming supreme authority, requiring submission, promising salvation in the form of wholeness. Hillman's polytheistic psychology was, in part, a protest against this covert monotheism. Just as polytheistic religions honor multiple gods, each with their own sphere of influence, none supreme, so a polytheistic psychology must honor multiple archetypal perspectives, each with their own validity, none having final authority. For Hillman, soul was more important than spirit. This distinction is crucial. Spirit, in Hillman's vocabulary, refers to the upward movement, the impulse toward transcendence, unity, light, clarity, abstraction. Spirit wants to rise above the mess of embodied existence, to achieve pure consciousness, to unify multiplicity into oneness. This is the movement of Apollo, of the hero, of the intellect, of mysticism in its world-denying forms. It is also, Hillman suggested, the movement of much of Jungian psychology with its emphasis on consciousness, on integration, on the self as a higher organizing principle. Soul, by contrast, refers to the downward movement, the impulse toward depth, multiplicity, darkness, complexity, embodiment. Soul loves the particular, the flawed, the concrete image in all its specificity. Soul is not interested in transcending the mess of life, but in descending into it, finding meaning within it, making poetry out of pathology. This is the movement of Persephone descending to the underworld, of Orpheus following Eurydice into death, of any willing descent into darkness in search of the soul's riches. Hillman argued that Western culture, including Western psychology, has been biased towards spirit at the expense of soul. We value ascent over descent, cure over care, heroism over pathos, unity over multiplicity, light over darkness. Jungian psychology, despite its tremendous contribution to recovering the imaginal, retained this spiritual bias. The individuation process was ultimately an ascent toward the self, a journey toward the light of consciousness, an attempt to rise above the fragmentation of ordinary psychic life into a higher unity. Archetypal psychology, Hillman proposed, would reverse this bias. It would value descent over ascent, soul-making over individuation, multiplicity over unity. It would honor the underworld and its gods, Hades, Persephone, Hecate, who had been neglected in favor of solar heroes and transcendent selves. It would see pathology not as something to be cured or integrated, but as the voice of soul, as the way depth announces itself in a flattened culture that has lost contact with the imaginal. This is why Hillman wrote so beautifully and provocatively about depression, and here the contrast with Jung becomes especially stark. For Jung, depression was typically understood as a state in which libido, psychic energy, had withdrawn from the conscious attitude and flowed into the unconscious. This withdrawal was compensatory. Consciousness had become too one-sided, and the unconscious was demanding attention. Depression was thus a call to turn inward, to attend to what the unconscious was trying to communicate, to adjust one's conscious attitude. Through dream work, active imagination, and symbolic understanding, one could reconnect with the unconscious, allow libido to flow again, and emerge from depression with a more balanced attitude and renewed energy for living. This is not a crude interpretation. Jung knew that depression was complex, that it could have physical as well as psychological dimensions, that it carried tremendous suffering. His compassion for the depressed person was real, but his understanding remained ultimately developmental. Depression was a stage, a dark night that preceded a new dawn, a descent that enabled later ascent. The meaning of depression lay in what came after, in the development it enabled. Hillman radicalized this understanding by refusing the developmental frame. Depression, he argued, is not a stage on the way to something else, but a mode of being with its own validity, its own way of knowing. It is the perspective of Hades, lord of the underworld, where everything slows down, darkens, deepens. In depression, the heroic ego with its projects and ambitions is brought low. The ordinary world loses its color and appeal. Energy drains away. Everything feels heavy, slow, dark. The conventional response, even in Jungian psychology, is to see this as a problem to be solved, a pathology to be cured. We want to bring the depressed person back up to the light, to restore their energy, to get them functioning again. But Hillman asked, what if depression is doing something important? What if it is pulling us down into depth, forcing us to slow down, preventing us from continuing in a mode of being that has lost soul? What if depression is soul's way of saying no to a life that has become too shallow, too fast, too focused on achievement and external success? From the underworld perspective, the problem is not depression, but the manic productivity that preceded it. The problem is a culture that has no place for dissent, for slowness, for staying with darkness long enough to discover what it contains. Hillman suggested that we need to be depressed, to spend time in the underworld, to allow the depth work that only happens there. This does not mean romanticizing suffering or refusing treatment for severe clinical depression. It means recognizing that the downward movement has value, that not everything that feels bad is pathological, that soul-making requires periodic descent into the dark. This valorization of the underworld was perhaps Hillman's most distinctive contribution, and it represented a profound challenge to Jung's emphasis on the self and individuation. Jung's psychology, for all its depth, remained fundamentally heroic in its structure. The ego, having been defeated and humbled, eventually achieves a relationship with the self, a kind of victory, an achievement of wholeness. This is still a hero's journey, still an ascent toward the light, even if it requires passing through darkness. The symbols Jung valued most, the mandala, the quaternity, the image of totality, all suggest wholeness, symmetry, achieved unity. Hillman rejected this heroic narrative. He pointed out that the hero myth is only one myth among many, and that other myths, particularly descent myths, offer equally valid and perhaps more necessary patterns for contemporary life. The myth of Persephone, abducted by Hades and forced to spend part of each year in the underworld, became for Hillman a central image. Persephone does not overcome the underworld. She becomes its queen. She does not integrate darkness into light. She learns to live in darkness, discovering that it has its own kind of vision, its own riches. Or consider the myth of Orpheus, who descends to retrieve his beloved Eurydice from death. He fails, of course, looking back at the last moment and losing her forever. For a heroic psychology, this is a tragedy, a failure. For Hillman, it is the necessary outcome. The point was not to bring Eurydice back to the upper world, to reverse death, to achieve mastery over the underworld. The point was the descent itself, the willingness to go down, the learning that occurs in that downward journey. Orpheus returns transformed by his failure, and his subsequent songs carry the depth of one who has been below. Jung knew the importance of descent. His own confrontation with the unconscious was a kind of descent, a willing entry into madness for the sake of understanding. But he also emphasized the return, the integration, the need to bring the gifts of the unconscious into conscious life. His entire emphasis on the transcendent function, on active imagination as a method, was about creating conversation between ego and unconscious, about building a bridge. The ego had to remain strong enough to relate to the unconscious without being overwhelmed by it. Hillman worried that this emphasis on a strong ego, on integration, on bringing unconscious material into consciousness, subtly perpetuated a kind of colonialism of the unconscious. The ego ventures down into the underworld, seizes its treasures, and brings them back up to serve ego's purposes. The unconscious is treated as a resource to be exploited for the sake of consciousness and its goals. Even if those goals are formulated in terms of the self rather than the ego, there is still a sense that the underworld exists to serve the upper world, that darkness exists to be brought to light, that multiplicity exists to be unified. A true underworld psychology, Hillman argued, would remain in the underworld, would develop an underworld consciousness that did not constantly seek to return to the light. This meant honoring symptoms, staying with pathology, resisting the therapeutic urge to cure and fix. It meant recognizing that some images want to remain in the dark, that some soul work happens precisely by not bringing things to consciousness, by letting them be, by visiting them where they are rather than extracting them. This therapeutic approach was radical, and it put Hillman at odds with many of his colleagues, both Jungian and otherwise. Psychotherapy, as conventionally practiced, aims at alleviating suffering, improving function, helping people feel better and live more successfully. Even Jungian analysis, with all its depth, ultimately aims at individuation, at a more conscious, integrated life. Hillman's archetypal psychology questioned these very aims. What if the point is not to feel better but to know oneself more deeply? What if symptoms are not obstacles to life but expressions of soul? What if successful functioning in a soulless culture is itself pathological? These questions aligned Hillman more with existential philosophers and artists than with medical practitioners. He was drawn to figures like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger thinkers who understood that anxiety, despair, and confrontation with meaninglessness were not pathologies but essential dimensions of human existence. He was drawn to poets like Keats, who wrote of negative capability, the capacity to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without irritable reaching after fact and reason. He was drawn to painters who depicted the dark and grotesque, to composers who explored dissonance and darkness. In this, Hillman was moving psychology closer to art and poetics, further from medicine and science. This was intentional. He argued that psychology had made a wrong turn in the late 19th century when it allied itself with medicine and adopted the medical model of diagnosis and treatment. Psychology became the study of pathology, and pathology became something to be eliminated rather than understood. The soul's expressions were reduced to symptoms, and symptoms were reduced to diseases requiring treatment. Jung had resisted this medical reductionism, insisting that symptoms were meaningful, that they carried messages from the unconscious. But even Jung retained the medical frame in certain ways. He was, after all, a psychiatrist, trained in a hospital, working with patients. His psychology emerged from clinical practice, and it retained a therapeutic orientation. The goal was healing, even if healing meant something much deeper and more comprehensive than mere symptom relief. Hillman pushed further, suggesting that psychology should ally itself not with medicine but with the humanities, with literature, art, philosophy, mythology. These disciplines know how to stay with images, how to read symbolically, how to honor ambiguity and complexity without rushing to conclusions. They do not aim to cure, but to deepen, to complicate, to reveal. A psychology that took the humanities as its model would be less therapeutic in the conventional sense and more educational in the deepest sense, leading out, educare, drawing forth soul. This brings us to Hillman's concept of soul-making, a term he borrowed from the Romantic poet John Keats. In a letter, Keats spoke of the world as the vale of soul-making, a place where souls are formed through experience, suffering, and imagination. Hillman seized on this phrase because it captured perfectly what he meant by the work of depth psychology. We are not born with completed souls that then need to be maintained or healed. Rather, soul is made, crafted, deepened through the ongoing work of living imaginally, of finding images for experience, of seeing through events to the mythic patterns they embody. Soul-making is not a process with an endpoint. It is not like individuation, which Jung understood as a lifelong process but still oriented toward the goal of the self. Soul-making has no goal except its own deepening. You cannot succeed or fail at soul-making. You can only do it or not do it. It requires a certain quality of attention, a willingness to pause with experience, to find the image within it, to let that image reveal its connections to the larger imaginal world. A simple example: you lose your job. The conventional response might be to feel disappointed, anxious about money, worried about your resume. A Jungian response might be to explore what this loss means symbolically. Perhaps it is death and rebirth. Perhaps it is a call from the self to change direction. Perhaps it is compensation for too much identification with work. Soul-making, as Hillman conceived it, would attend to the specific images that arise around this loss. Maybe you dream of an empty office, and the quality of emptiness itself becomes important not as a symbol of something else, but as an experience of a certain kind of space, a certain kind of silence. Maybe you find yourself thinking about Hephaestus, the craftsman god, and you realize that losing your job feels like being thrown out of Olympus, cast down, forced to set up a workshop in the underworld. The soul-making work is staying with these images, letting them unfold, finding the poetry in the situation. This poetic approach to psychology was both Hillman's gift and, to his critics, his limitation. He could make symptoms sing, turn pathology into poetry, find soul in the most unexpected places. His writing had a literary quality, a beauty and depth that made readers think differently about their own experience. But did this approach actually help people? Could you make a living as a therapist by sitting with patients and finding poetic images for their suffering without offering some sense of development, some hope of improvement? Hillman would respond that the question itself reveals the problem. We are so captured by the heroic, therapeutic, progressive narrative that we cannot imagine psychological work that does not aim at improvement. But what if staying with suffering, finding its images, discovering its imaginal richness, is itself valuable, even if it does not make the suffering go away? What if some suffering should not go away because it is soul's voice, soul's claim on us? What if the deepening that comes from such work is more important than feeling better? This question brings us to the heart of the difference between Jung's analytical psychology and Hillman's archetypal psychology, and it is a difference that cannot be easily resolved. Both perspectives have truth. Jung's emphasis on the self, on integration, on individuation as a developmental process, speaks to a real need for coherence, for some organizing center that prevents fragmentation and chaos. Without some concept like the self, how does the ego navigate between competing archetypal demands? How does one make choices when Aphrodite says yes and Artemis says no, when Dionysus urges ecstatic release and Apollo demands measured clarity? The self, in Jung's psychology, provides the authority to adjudicate such conflicts, not by eliminating one side, but by finding a third position that honors both while transcending their conflict. Hillman's emphasis on polytheistic multiplicity, on sticking with the image, on soul-making without a goal, speaks to a different truth. Life is not coherent. The psyche is not unified. We contain multitudes, and those multitudes are in conflict. Any attempt to impose unity from above, whether that be the ego's will or the self's authority, does violence to the legitimate plurality of soul. Better to live with the conflicts, to develop the capacity to inhabit different archetypal perspectives at different times, to honor the multiplicity even when it is uncomfortable. Perhaps the deepest way to understand their difference is through the metaphor of religion. Jung's psychology is implicitly monotheistic. There is one God, the self, and all other archetypal figures are subordinate to it, finding their meaning in relation to it. The psychological journey is toward this one God, toward union or at least relationship with the supreme principle. This provides coherence, meaning a sense of direction. It also, as any monotheism does, creates an orthodoxy, a sense that there is a right way to be, that certain archetypal expressions are more legitimate than others when they align with the self's purposes. Hillman's psychology is polytheistic. There are many gods, each with their own temples, none supreme. The psychological life involves moving between temples, honoring now this god, now that one, learning the specific worship appropriate to each. There is no central authority to appeal to, no supreme god who can resolve conflicts between lesser gods. This creates pluralism, flexibility, a certain democratic spirit. It also creates uncertainty, ongoing conflict, the absence of any final resolution or meaning, which is true. Both and neither, the psyche is complex enough to contain both realities. There are moments when unity is experienced, when something like Jung's self seems real and necessary, when the diverse elements of psyche come together in a moment of grace, and we glimpse wholeness. There are also moments when multiplicity is the reality, when we are torn between incompatible desires, when no synthesis is possible, when we must simply honor the conflict and learn to live with it. Jung's psychology speaks to the first kind of moment, Hillman's to the second. Let us consider how their different approaches would understand one of the most important and difficult concepts in depth psychology, the shadow. For Jung, the shadow was perhaps the first and most important figure to be encountered on the individuation journey. The shadow comprises all those aspects of ourselves that we have rejected, disowned, or never developed qualities that the ego finds unacceptable based on personal history and cultural conditioning. For a man raised to be gentle and accommodating, the shadow might contain aggression and selfishness. For a woman taught to be selfless and nurturing, the shadow might hold ambition and self-interest. The shadow appears in dreams, as figures of the same sex as the dreamer, often threatening or disturbing. It appears in projection when we see in others qualities that actually belong to our own shadow. Jung considered shadow work essential because whatever remains unconscious and projected causes problems. We see enemies everywhere. We create conflicts. We remain split within ourselves. The task is to recognize the shadow, to withdraw projections, to acknowledge and gradually integrate these disowned aspects. This does not mean acting out every shadow impulse, but it does mean acknowledging them, dialoguing with them, finding appropriate expressions. Shadow integration, for Jung, was necessary but not sufficient for individuation. Beyond the personal shadow lay the collective shadow, the dark side of humanity, the capacity for evil that belongs to our species. And beyond shadow work lay encounter with the contrasexual figures, anima and animus, and eventually with the self. Shadow work was the beginning, the necessary groundwork, but not the goal. Hillman would both honor and critique this understanding. He would agree that we disown aspects of ourselves and project them outward. He would agree that recognizing these projections and acknowledging these disowned aspects is important psychological work. But he would resist the entire framework of integration. The shadow, in Hillman's view, is not primarily something to be integrated. It is an archetypal perspective in its own right, deserving of recognition, relationship, and even worship. Hillman might point to the way various cultures had rituals and festivals dedicated to shadow figures. The Roman Saturnalia, when slaves became masters and masters became slaves, honored the reversal of normal order. Trickster figures in many mythologies, Loki, Hermes in his thieving aspect. Coyote embodies shadow qualities and are honored as gods, not as aspects to be integrated into a more respectable ego. The Greek god Pan, with his animal lower body and his propensity to cause sudden terror, was worshipped in his own shrines. These traditions recognize that shadow is not just personal disowned content, but an archetypal perspective with its own validity. To integrate the shadow, in Hillman's critique, risks domesticating it, bringing it under ego control, making it serve the ego's or the self's purposes. A truly honoring relationship with shadow would let it remain other, would visit it in its own territory, would allow it to disturb and disrupt without trying to incorporate it into a unified personality. Shadow work, from this perspective, is not about becoming whole, but about developing relationship with the figures who live in the dark, on their own terms, in their own realm. This difference is not abstract. It shapes how a therapist would work with, say, a patient's anger. A Jungian therapist might help the patient recognize disowned anger, understand its roots, find appropriate ways to express it, ultimately integrating this energy into a more balanced personality. The goal is for the patient to have access to anger when appropriate, without being overwhelmed by it or completely split off from it, a mature relationship with an aspect of oneself. A Hillmanesque therapist might approach the same anger by staying with its images. When the anger arises, what does it look like? Does it have the quality of Ares, the war god direct, hot, combative? Or is it more like the anger of Hera, the betrayed wife, cold, calculating, seeking revenge, or like Artemis defending her boundaries, fierce, protective, drawing a line? By staying with the specific quality of this anger, by honoring it as a visitation from a particular archetypal perspective, the therapist helps the patient develop a relationship with the God who is angry through them. The goal is not to integrate anger into a balanced personality, but to recognize its archetypal nature, to honor it, perhaps even to build it and alter, metaphorically or literally. This difference extends to how each thinker understood neurosis and pathology. Jung saw neurosis as essentially a state of one-sidedness, imbalance, and unconsciousness. The neurotic person is split off from important aspects of themselves, identified too strongly with one side of an opposition while repressing the other. Neurosis is also purposive. It forces the person to stop, to turn inward, to attend to what has been neglected. In this sense, neurosis is the beginning of individuation, the psyche's way of initiating the person into deeper self-knowledge. Treatment, for Jung, involved bringing the unconscious into consciousness, integrating shadow, relating to anima or animus, ultimately developing a relationship with the self. The symptoms would often spontaneously resolve not because they were directly treated, but because the underlying psychic imbalance was addressed. A woman's anxiety attacks might cease when she recognized and honored her own autonomous authority rather than constantly deferring to others. A man's depression might lift when he acknowledged the anima's demand for relationship and interiority, rather than living exclusively through external achievement. Hillman's approach to neurosis was more radical. He suggested that we should not speak of neurosis at all, or at least not in the way conventional psychology does. The word neurosis medicalizes what is essentially an imaginal or soul condition. When someone is anxious, depressed, obsessive, or phobic, they are not suffering from a disease or even from a psychic imbalance. They are in the grip of an archetypal perspective, experiencing life through a particular mythic lens. Hillman's book Revisioning Psychology includes a brilliant section on pathologizing, where he argues that the urge to pathologize, to see things as sick, wrong, in need of fixing, is itself one mode of psychological activity, not the objective truth about other modes. When we call something pathological, we are taking a particular perspective, usually a heroic or medical one, that values health, strength, and normal functioning. But from other archetypal perspectives, what looks like pathology looks different. From the perspective of Hades, depression is not pathology, but the natural state of being in the underworld. From the perspective of Dionysus, what psychiatry calls mania might be divine ecstasy. From the perspective of Aphrodite, what looks like obsessive love is the god's possession, a sacred madness. This does not mean denying the suffering involved in these states. It means recognizing that suffering itself has imaginal depth, that it is not merely negative. Hillman distinguished between curing and caring. Curing aims to eliminate the symptom to restore normal functioning. Caring stays with the symptom, tends to it, seeks to understand what it wants, what soul is doing through it. A caring approach would not necessarily try to alleviate someone's depression quickly, but would stay with it long enough to discover what underworld work is occurring. This approach risks being misunderstood as indifference to suffering, but Hillman would argue that true care requires patience with the soul's process rather than rushing to cure. This perspective led Hillman to critique the entire pharmaceutical approach to psychological suffering. If depression is the voice of Hades, if anxiety is soul's response to a life lived superficially, then medicating these states away is an act of silencing soul. This is a controversial position, and Hillman was often accused of romanticizing mental illness. His response would be that not all suffering is mental illness, that we have pathologized normal human responses to difficult life circumstances and to soulless cultural conditions. Hillman's cultural criticism, in fact, was inseparable from his psychology. He argued that much of what we call individual pathology is actually appropriate response to a sick culture. Contemporary Western culture has lost contact with soul, with imagination, with the gods. It is literalistic, materialistic, obsessed with surfaces and with practical utility. It has no place for the underworld, for contemplation, for imaginal reality. In such a culture, the person who is depressed, who cannot function according to the culture's demands, might be the healthy one, the one in whom soul is still alive and protesting. Jung, too, recognized that modern culture had lost something essential. His critique of modernity's rationalism, its loss of myth and ritual, its split between science and religion, runs throughout his work. He saw neurosis as often resulting from the loss of religious connection, the absence of meaningful symbols and rituals. Modern people suffered, Jung believed, because they had lost contact with the archetypal foundations of meaning. But Jung's response was to help individuals reconnect with these foundations through the individuation process. He developed active imagination, dream work, and engagement with symbolic material as methods for individuals to recover what the culture had lost. His psychology was ultimately compensatory, providing what modernity lacked. It was also, in a sense, conservative, helping people adapt to modern life while maintaining connection to deeper sources of meaning. Hillman's response was less compensatory and more radical. He wanted not just to help individuals cope with soulless culture, but to reimagine culture itself. His later work, particularly The Soul's Code and A Terrible Love of War, engaged directly with social and political themes. He argued that we need to recover a polytheistic sensibility, recognizing the legitimacy of different values and perspectives rather than imposing monotheistic unity. He wrote about how cities could be resouled, how architecture could honor imaginal reality, how education could cultivate imagination rather than merely training workers for the economy. In this cultural criticism, Hillman aligned himself more with the radical tradition of Wilhelm Reich, Norman O. Brown, and Herbert Marcuse than with Jung's more individualistic approach. Where Jung focused on the individual's relationship to the collective unconscious, Hillman wanted to change the collective itself. This required not just individual soul-making, but cultural soul-making, a reimagining of our institutions, practices, and shared images. Despite these differences in scope and radicality, both Jung and Hillman were fundamentally opposed to the dominant trends of 20th century psychology. The behaviorist tradition, which reduced human beings to stimulus-response mechanisms, was anathema to both. The cognitive approach, which focused on conscious thought processes while ignoring the unconscious and imagination, seemed superficial to both. Even the psychoanalytic tradition, despite Freud's acknowledgement of the unconscious, seemed too reductive, too focused on drive and conflict, too committed to strengthening ego control. Both Jung and Hillman insisted that human beings are fundamentally meaning-making creatures, that we live in and through symbols and images, that the psyche has its own reality not reducible to brain chemistry or social conditioning. Both honor the autonomy of the unconscious, its capacity to produce images and insights that consciousness could never manufacture. Both understood that true psychological change happens not through willpower or behavioral modification, but through engagement with images at the imaginal level. Where they differed was in what they did with this shared foundation. Jung built a comprehensive system, a psychology with clear concepts, developmental stages, and therapeutic goals. He wanted to create a science of the soul, to map the collective unconscious as thoroughly as possible, to provide both patients and analysts with clear principles to guide the work. His books, while often difficult, attempted to be systematic, to explain and categorize, to make the unconscious comprehensible to consciousness. Hillman resisted systematization. His writing was more essayistic, more exploratory, deliberately unsystematic. He would circle around ideas, approaching them from multiple perspectives, refusing definitive conclusions. He wanted to exemplify in his very method what he advocated in content multiplicity, polytheism, resistance to unity. His books read more like extended meditations or poetic explorations than systematic treatises. This style frustrated readers looking for clear answers, but it was faithful to his vision of psychology as an ongoing imaginative practice rather than a body of established knowledge. This difference in style reflected a difference in their relationships to authority. Jung, despite his rebellion against Freud and conventional thinking, maintained a certain patriarchal authority. He was the wise elder, the one who knew, the carrier of deep knowledge. His presence in the analytic relationship was powerful, even overwhelming at times. Patients came to Jung to be guided toward the self, to receive the wisdom of one who had made the journey. Hillman, influenced by the 60s and 70s critique of authority, tried to deauthorize the analyst. The analyst was not the wise one who knows, but a fellow soul engaged in the imaginal work. The analyst's task was not to interpret or guide, but to stay with the patient's images, to help them see more deeply into those images. This was a more egalitarian vision of therapy, less hierarchical. It also removed some of the therapeutic power and mystique that surrounded the Jungian analyst. Let us turn now to their different understandings of one of the most important concepts in depth psychology, the complex. Jung discovered complexes early in his career through the word association test. When test subjects responded to certain stimulus words with delayed reaction times, altered galvanic skin response, and disturbed associations, Jung recognized that he had touched on a complex, a cluster of emotionally charged ideas operating with a certain autonomy. The mother complex, the father complex, the inferiority complex. These were not just Freudian neurotic formations, but autonomous centers of psychological life. Jung came to see complexes as fragments of psyche that had split off from ego consciousness, often due to trauma or conflict, and which then operated independently. Each complex had an archetypal core. The mother complex, for instance, was built around the mother archetype, colored by personal experience with the actual mother. Complexes were problematic when they possessed consciousness. When someone was in a complex, they could not think clearly. They reacted automatically. They were not free. The goal of analysis was to become conscious of complexes, to recognize when they were activated, and ultimately to integrate them. This did not mean eliminating complexes. Jung recognized they were permanent structures, but rather developing an ego that could observe complex activation without being identified with it. A mature person still has a mother complex, but they can recognize when it is activated and can choose how to respond rather than being driven by it. Hillman took Jung's discovery of the complex and radicalized it. Instead of seeing complexes as problems to be managed or integrated, Hillman saw them as the very structure of psyche. We do not have complexes. We are complexes. There is no ego standing apart from complexes, observing them, integrating them. Rather, what we call ego is itself a complex, the ego complex, no more central or authoritative than other complexes. The psyche is a multiplicity of complexes, each with its own perspective, its own voice, its own agenda. This was a profoundly decentering vision. It removed the ego from its privileged position. It suggested that the internal conversation is not between ego and unconscious, or between ego and self, but among multiple complexes, none of which has final authority. We are, Hillman suggested, more like a parliament or a committee than like a unified self. And just as in a parliament, there is ongoing debate, competing interests, shifting alliances. Hillman connected this vision to his polytheistic psychology. Each complex is like a god, a center of autonomous psychic life with its own values and demands. The complex organized around achievement and recognition might be Apollo or perhaps Hera. The complex organized around pleasure and beauty is Aphrodite. The complex organized around anger and combat is Aries. Rather than trying to integrate these into a unified self, psychological maturity involves recognizing the different gods who speak through us and learning to honor each in appropriate contexts. This vision had interesting implications for therapy. If there is no central ego to strengthen and no self to individuate toward, what is the therapeutic goal? Hillman suggested that the goal is to complicate consciousness, to become aware of the multiple perspectives operating within, and to develop a kind of imaginal ego that can move among them without getting stuck in any single perspective. This is different from integration, which implies bringing things together into unity. It is more like developing a kind of psychological polyglottism, speaking multiple psychological languages. Imagine a man who comes to therapy because he cannot maintain relationships. A Jungian analyst might explore his anima, his mother complex, his shadow issues around intimacy. The work would aim at helping him become more conscious of these patterns and developing a more mature capacity for relationship, guided ultimately by the self's image of wholeness, which includes relationship. A Hillmanesque analyst might explore which gods are in conflict around relationship. Perhaps Apollo's need for distance and clarity conflicts with Aphrodite's desire for closeness and merging. Perhaps Artemis's need for autonomy conflicts with Hera's desire for committed marriage. Rather than trying to resolve this conflict through integration, the analyst would help the patient recognize and honor each perspective. The therapeutic goal is not to achieve mature relationship, but to understand the imaginal drama of relationship, to see the gods at work, to develop a more conscious relationship to the complexes that constitute one's psyche. This approach might seem less therapeutically useful after all. The man still cannot maintain relationships, but Hillman would argue that understanding the archetypal dimensions of his difficulty is more important than achieving successful functioning. Perhaps the inability to maintain relationships is not a problem to be solved, but a psychological reality to be understood. Perhaps this man's psyche needs both connection and solitude, and any stable relationship would violate one god or the other. Perhaps the therapeutic success is not achieving a stable relationship, but developing a conscious relationship to the gods who speak through him. This brings us to one of the most significant differences between Jung and Hillman, their attitudes toward healing and cure. Jung was, despite everything, a healer. His psychology aimed at alleviating suffering, promoting growth, helping people live more fully. Individuation was not just an intellectual concept, but a lived process that made life more meaningful and bearable. Jung's compassion for suffering humanity permeates his work. He wanted to help. Hillman's relationship to healing was more ambiguous. On one hand, he cared deeply about soul, about depth, about the quality of psychological life. His writing aimed to help readers see differently, think differently, live with more imagination. On the other hand, he resisted the therapeutic culture's obsession with feeling better, with cure, with progress. He famously wrote, "We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse," suggesting that the inward turn of therapy might actually distract from necessary cultural and political engagement. Hillman worried that therapy had become a substitute for soul, that instead of doing the deep imaginal work, people went to therapy to adjust, to cope, to feel better so they could function in a soulless culture. The therapeutic goal of adjustment seemed to him a betrayal of soul, which often demands not adjustment, but disturbance, not comfort, but confrontation with difficult truths. If you are depressed because your life lacks meaning, the answer is not to take an antidepressant and continue living a meaningless life, but to honor the depression as soul's protest and to radically reimagine your life. This critique of therapy was part of Hillman's broader critique of psychology's professionalization, the establishment of psychology as a scientific discipline, the licensing and credentialing of therapists, the development of diagnostic manuals and treatment protocols. All of this seemed to Hillman a bureaucratization of soul, a transformation of imaginal work into a service industry. He longed for a return to an older tradition in which soul work was part of philosophy, education, religion, art, not a specialized profession but a dimension of living. Jung had complicated feelings about psychology's professionalization. He founded institutes to train analysts, established standards and practices, wrote extensively about technique. He wanted analytical psychology to be recognized as a legitimate discipline. Yet he also maintained that the real work happened in the encounter between two individuals, that no amount of training could substitute for the analyst's own psychological development, and that the best analysts were those who had undergone their own dark nights of the soul. Both men, then, were suspicious of psychology as mere technique, of therapy as mere application of methods. Both insisted on the primacy of the imaginal, the symbolic, the soulful, but Jung maintained more faith in the possibility of a healing profession, a psychology that could be both deep and practical, both soulful and helpful. Hillman's increasing skepticism about therapy represented a purist position, perhaps, or a realization that the therapeutic culture had moved so far from soul that it could not be reformed from within. Let us consider their different approaches to dreams, that royal road to the unconscious. For Jung, dreams were messages from the unconscious, compensating one-sided conscious attitudes, pointing toward developmental next steps, revealing archetypal patterns. His method of dream interpretation involved exploring personal associations, amplifying images through mythological and cultural parallels, and discerning the dream's compensatory or prospective function. Was the dream showing what consciousness lacked? Was it warning of dangers in the current path? Was it revealing archetypal patterns relevant to the dreamer's individuation? Jung encouraged active imagination with dream figures, a practice in which the dreamer, in a meditative state, would engage in dialogue with dream characters, allowing them to speak, listening to their wisdom or their demands. Through such engagement, the autonomous figures of the psyche could be known, related to, and gradually integrated into a more comprehensive consciousness. The goal was to bring unconscious content into relationship with the ego, building the bridge that the transcendent function required. Hillman agreed that dreams were immensely important, but he approached them differently. His book, The Dream and the Underworld, articulated his perspective. Dreams, Hillman argued, do not come from the unconscious, a spatial metaphor that suggests an inside from which contents emerge. Rather, dreams are the underworld, the realm of the dead, the imaginal dimension. When we dream, we are in that realm. The figures we meet are not symbols of something else, not messages to be decoded, but presences to be encountered on their own terms. This shift is subtle but important. For Jung, the dream is about something about the dreamer's psychological situation, about their developmental process, about their relationship to the self. For Hillman, the dream is not about anything. It is a place, an experience, a realm to be visited. The question is not, what does this dream mean? But what is happening in this dream? What is the quality of this imaginal experience? Hillman distinguished between day world and night world consciousness. Day world consciousness is ego consciousness, concerned with literal reality, with cause and effect, with personal identity and continuity. Night world consciousness is the dream state, where different laws apply, where identity is fluid, where causality works differently. The mistake of most dream interpretation, Hillman argued, is to translate night world into day world terms, to bring the dream back to ego's concerns and ego's language. Instead, Hillman proposed going native in the dream world, learning its language, honoring its otherness. A dream of death, for instance, does not symbolize transformation or ego death in the day world. In the dream world, death is death and ending, a passage to the realm of shades, an underworld reality. To interpret it as really meaning transformation is to refuse the dream its own reality, to colonize the night world with day world meanings. This approach changes the entire practice of working with dreams. Instead of interpreting, Hillman advocated what he called working the dream. This involves staying with the dream images, allowing them to work on consciousness, returning to them repeatedly, letting them reveal themselves more fully over time. It means not rushing to understand or apply the dream, but living with it as one would live with a poem or a painting, allowing it to continue to speak. Hillman also insisted on the primacy of images over narrative. Most dream work focuses on the dream narrative, what happened, the sequence of events, the story, but Hillman suggested that the images themselves are more important than the story that links them. The black dog, the locked door, the stormy sea, these images have their own presence and power, independent of the narrative that connects them. Working the dream means attending to each image on its own, not just to the plot. This image-focused approach aligned with Hillman's broader emphasis on sticking with the image. In both dreams and waking life, Hillman urged staying with the images that arise, resisting the interpretive move that translates image into concept. An image of water is not primarily a symbol of emotion or the unconscious or the feminine. It is water, with its specific qualities of fluidity, depth, cleansing, drowning. Staying with the image means exploring these qualities, phenomenologically, letting the image reveal its own meanings rather than imposing meanings from a theoretical framework. Jung would not have disagreed entirely with this approach. He too valued the image and warned against reductive interpretation. His method of amplification aimed at enriching the image by connecting it to its mythological and symbolic resonances. But there is a difference in emphasis. Jung amplified the image in order to understand its archetypal meaning, which then had implications for the individuation process. Hillman stayed with the image more for its own sake, resisting the move toward developmental implications. This difference extends to their understanding of symbols. For Jung, a symbol was something that pointed beyond itself to something that could not be directly represented, an archetype, the self, a level of psychic reality too deep for literal representation. The symbol was a bridge, a mediating function, allowing something from the unconscious to enter consciousness without losing its numinous quality. A true symbol could not be fully understood or reduced to a single meaning. It remained alive, generative, opening toward the unknown. Jung distinguished symbols from signs. A sign simply represents something else with a one-to-one correspondence. A red light means stop. It is a sign, not a symbol. But a mandala, a cross, a tree of life, these are symbols, carrying multiple layers of meaning, resonating with archetypal depths. Jung's therapeutic work involved helping patients discover and create symbols that could mediate their relationship with the unconscious, particularly with the self. Hillman, characteristically, deconstructed this formulation. He questioned whether the distinction between symbol and sign was as clear as Jung suggested, and whether the notion that symbols point to something beyond themselves was not itself problematic. For Hillman, an image does not point beyond itself. It is itself. It does not represent an archetype. It is an archetypal manifestation. The image is not a bridge to something else, but is itself the reality we are seeking. This might seem like hair-splitting, but it reflects a fundamental philosophical difference. Jung's thought retained a kind of Platonic structure. There are ideal forms, archetypes as such, which can never be directly perceived, and there are archetypal images, which are manifestations or representations of these deeper realities. Hillman rejected this two-world model. For him, influenced by Renaissance Neoplatonists like Ficino, the imaginal realm is not a reflection of something else, not a representation, but is itself a primary reality. The image is not a bridge to the archetype. The image is the archetype as it manifests in the imaginal realm. This philosophical difference has practical implications. Jung's approach encouraged seeking the archetype behind the image, finding the universal in the particular, connecting the personal to the collective. Hillman's approach encouraged staying with the particular, honoring the image's specificity, resisting the move to the universal. Both approaches have value, but they lead in different directions. Jung toward unity and universality, Hillman toward multiplicity and particularity. We should pause here to consider the influence of other thinkers on both Jung and Hillman, because their different philosophical frameworks drew on different traditions. Jung was influenced by Kant's epistemology, which suggested that we cannot know things in themselves, but only phenomena as structured by the categories of mind. Jung translated this into psychological terms. We cannot know archetypes as such, only archetypal images as they appear to consciousness. He was also influenced by Schopenhauer's notion of will as the thing in itself underlying representation, which Jung psychologized into the concept of psychic energy, libido. Jung's deep engagement with Gnosticism, alchemy, and Eastern religions all reinforced his sense of universal patterns underlying diverse cultural expressions. He saw the same archetypal motifs appearing in Christian alchemy, Tibetan Buddhism, Hindu Kundalini Yoga, and African tribal religions. This supported his notion of a collective unconscious containing universal patterns, and it reinforced his move towards seeking commonalities, universal structures, the self as supreme organizing principle. Hillman drew on different philosophical sources. His deepest debt was to Renaissance Neoplatonism, particularly Marsilio Ficino and the tradition of Platonic psychology. From these sources, Hillman drew the concept of the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world as a distinct ontological realm, neither purely material nor purely spiritual. This realm had its own reality, its own laws, and it was populated by images that were not merely psychological but had their own kind of being. Hillman was also influenced by phenomenology, particularly Heidegger's notion of being in the world in his critique of metaphysics. Heidegger argued that Western philosophy had fallen into a pattern of seeking grounds, foundations, ultimate principles, what he called ontotheology. This search for ultimate grounds obscured the actual phenomena, the things themselves as they appear. Hillman applied this critique to Jungian psychology. The search for the self, for the archetype as such behind the image, was a form of ontotheology that obscured the actual images that constitute psychic life. From the postmodern philosophers, particularly Derrida and Foucault, Hillman drew a suspicion of grand unified theories and a sensitivity to how power operates through normalizing discourses. He saw Jung's individuation narrative as another grand narrative that subtly imposed norms and suppressed multiplicity. This postmodern influence made Hillman's work appealing to a generation of scholars and therapists who were questioning authority and seeking more pluralistic approaches. Yet Hillman was not simply a postmodernist. His commitment to soul, to the reality of the imaginal, to the autonomy of archetypal figures, distinguished him from the more skeptical and deconstructive postmodernists. Hillman believed in something in soul, in image, in the gods, even as he deconstructed Jung's systematic framework. His was a strange hybrid, a postmodern Platonist, a polytheistic psychologist, a radical who drew on ancient sources. This hybridity makes Hillman difficult to categorize, and it is part of his enduring appeal and frustration. He cannot be easily placed in a school or movement. He was Jungian and post-Jungian, modern and postmodern, psychological and anti-psychological. This very multiplicity, this resistance to easy categorization, exemplified his commitment to polytheism, to multiplicity, to resisting unity. Let us now explore one of the most practically important differences between Jung and Hillman: their approaches to transference and the therapeutic relationship. For Jung, transference was central to the analytic process. He understood transference as the projection of unconscious contents, particularly archetypal contents, onto the analyst. The patient might experience the analyst as a wise old man, a magician, a father figure, a divine savior projections of the self, the wise old man archetype, the father complex. Jung distinguished stages of transference, often illustrated through medieval alchemical texts that depicted relationships between male and female figures undergoing transformations. The transference created a container, a temenos, within which the work of transformation could occur. The analyst had to be conscious of these projections without taking them personally, understanding them as part of the individuation process. Eventually, the projections would need to be withdrawn, the patient recognizing that what they saw in the analyst actually belonged to their own psyche. The counter-transference, the analyst's emotional reactions to the patient, was equally important. Jung recognized that the analyst was affected by the patient, that the analytic relationship was a mutual involvement. The analyst had to be aware of their own reactions, use them as information about what was happening in the shared analytic field, and work on their own complexes that might be activated by the patient. This emphasis on transference gave the Jungian analytic relationship a certain intensity and importance. The analysis itself became a temenos, a sacred space where transformation occurred through the relationship. The analyst held a significant role, carrying projections, providing a stable presence, guiding the process. There was an implicit hierarchy. The analyst knew more, had gone further in the individuation process, could see things the patient could not yet see. Hillman's approach to transference was characteristically more deconstructive. He questioned whether transference was as central as Jung suggested, whether the notion of projection and withdrawal of projection was not itself a day-world concept imposed on imaginal reality. In the essay on psychological language, Hillman explored how the very language we use to describe psychological events shapes what we see. When we speak of projection, we imply that something internal is being cast outward onto something external, and that this is a mistake to be corrected. But what if the images that arise between patient and analyst are not projections, but actual imaginal events occurring in the space between them? What if the patient who sees the analyst as a wise old man is not projecting their own inner wise old man, but rather encountering Hermes or Mercurius, the mediating god who appears in the analytic space? This shift from projection to imaginal reality changes the therapeutic task. Instead of helping the patient withdraw projections and recognize them as their own, the analyst helps the patient understand the archetypal reality being encountered. The wise old man is not yours or mine, but an archetypal presence that appears between us. Our task is to honor this presence, understand what it wants, what it is doing in this relationship. Hillman was suspicious of the power dynamics implicit in Jungian transference work. The notion that the analyst knows what is really happening, that the patient is projecting, that the transference is at such and such a stage, gives the analyst tremendous authority. The patient's experience is constantly being reinterpreted by the analyst according to the analyst's theoretical framework. This can be a subtle form of domination, even when done with the best intentions. Hillman advocated for a more egalitarian therapeutic relationship. Both analyst and patient are engaged in soul-making. Both are working with images. Neither has a privileged position. The analyst's expertise lies not in knowing more about the patient's psyche than the patient does, but in having developed skills at working with images, at staying with them, at resisting premature interpretation. The analyst is more like a companion on the journey or a fellow worshiper in the temple than like a guide who knows the way. This democratization of therapy aligned with Hillman's broader cultural and political commitments. He was suspicious of expertise, of professional authority, of the way professionalization creates hierarchies and excludes ordinary people from what should be common wisdom. Soul work should not require a PhD and a license. It should be part of education, conversation, living. Yet one can question whether Hillman's approach dilutes the therapeutic power of the analytic relationship. Jung's notion of transference, for all its hierarchical implications, recognizes that something powerful happens in the space between analyst and patient, that the relationship itself is transformative. By deconstructing transference, Hillman might lose this power, reducing therapy to an intellectual exercise in image work. Hillman would respond that the power of the relationship comes not from transference, but from the mutual engagement with imaginal reality. When two people enter the temple together, when they genuinely attend to the images that arise between them, when they honor the gods who appear, that is powerful. The power comes not from the analyst's authority or from the patient's projections, but from the reality of the imaginal realm they enter together. This brings us to their different understandings of imagination and active imagination. Jung developed active imagination as a method of engaging with unconscious contents. In a state between waking and sleeping, the practitioner would allow images to arise and would then engage with them, dialogue with them, sometimes enacting them through movement or art. The key was to maintain ego consciousness while allowing the unconscious to express itself, creating a conversation between ego and unconscious. Jung saw active imagination as a more advanced technique than dream interpretation because it involved conscious participation. Instead of passively receiving dreams and then interpreting them, the practitioner actively entered into the imaginal realm, encountered figures there, and engaged with them. This practice built the transcendent function, that capacity of the psyche to generate symbols that unite conscious and unconscious. Through active imagination, Jung and his patients encountered figures who became ongoing presences in their psychic lives: wise old men, anima figures, shadow figures, and eventually figures of the self. These encounters were often transformative, providing guidance, challenging the ego's position, opening new possibilities. Jung's own visions during his confrontation with the unconscious, his encounters with figures like Philemon and Salome, were examples of active imagination, and they profoundly shaped his subsequent thinking. Hillman accepted the importance of active imagination but modified it in characteristic ways. He was less interested in the dialogue between ego and unconscious, less focused on the developmental implications. Instead, he was interested in the imaginal realm as a place to inhabit, in the figures encountered there as autonomous beings with their own reality, not as projections or symbols of something else. Hillman emphasized that imagination is not something we do, but something that happens to us. We do not create images, we receive them. The imagination, in the romantic and Neoplatonic sense Hillman drew on, is not a faculty of mind, but a dimension of reality. It is the realm between matter and spirit, where images have their own existence. To practice imagination is to become receptive to this realm, to allow its images to appear, to honor them. This shift from active to receptive imagination is subtle but significant. Jung's active imagination implies agency. The ego actively engages, dialogues, questions. Hillman's approach is more passive, more receptive, more about witnessing than engaging. You do not interrogate the image, demanding it reveal its meaning or purpose. You attend to it, stay with it, let it be what it is. This receptive approach connected to Hillman's emphasis on pathos over logos. Western philosophy and psychology have been dominated by logos, reason, order, comprehension, mastery. We want to understand, to explain, to control. But pathos, suffering, being affected, undergoing, has been neglected. Hillman's psychology was a psychology of pathos, of being affected by images, of suffering the imagination, of allowing oneself to be moved by soul. This emphasis on pathos, on being affected, on suffering, might seem to contradict Hillman's insistence on the multiplicity and autonomy of images. If we are constantly being affected and moved, do we not lose all agency, all coherence? This is a real tension in Hillman's work, one he never fully resolved. On one hand, he wanted to dethrone the ego, to show that we are not the masters of our psyches. On the other hand, he wanted to develop a kind of imaginal consciousness that could navigate among multiple perspectives without being overwhelmed. Perhaps the resolution lies in recognizing that Hillman was describing a capacity that develops through practice. Initially, we are identified with one perspective, usually the ego's, and other perspectives appear as threats or disturbances. Through soul-making, through repeated work with images, through learning to inhabit different archetypal perspectives, we develop a more fluid consciousness that can move among perspectives without being stuck in any. This is not the unity of the self, not an achieved wholeness, but a practiced multiplicity, a learned capacity to shapeshift among imaginal positions. This capacity might be understood as what Renaissance Neoplatonists called the imaginative soul, or what Romantic poets called the poetic imagination. It is a consciousness that can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, that can see from different angles, that can honor contradictions without needing to resolve them. This is different from Jungian integration, which seeks to unite opposites into a third thing. It is more like a perpetual movement among positions, a constant shifting of perspective. Let us consider now how Jung and Hillman each understood the relationship between individual psychology and collective or cultural reality. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious was fundamentally collective. The archetypes belonged not to individuals but to humanity as a whole. However, Jung's therapeutic work focused primarily on the individual's relationship to this collective dimension. Individuation was a personal process, even when it involved connecting to transpersonal realities. Jung did write about collective phenomena, his essays on the psychology of fascism, on the plight of modern man, on the spiritual problems of modern society, but these were applications of his individual psychology to cultural phenomena. He understood collective movements as the result of masses of individuals in whom certain archetypes were activated. The rise of Nazism, for instance, represented the activation of the Wotan archetype in the German people, the old Germanic god of storm and frenzy taking possession of the collective psyche. Jung's response to cultural problems was ultimately individualistic. He believed that the world would change only as individuals underwent inner transformation. There was no collective solution to collective problems. Only individual work on the self would ultimately affect the collective. This made Jung's political stance somewhat quietistic. He did not advocate for political action or social change, but rather for individual soul work that would eventually have collective effects. Hillman grew increasingly dissatisfied with this individualism. In his later work, particularly in essays collected in City of Soul and in A Terrible Love of War, he engaged more directly with political and cultural questions. He argued that psychology had become too interior, too focused on the individual, and that this interiority was itself a problem, a retreat from collective responsibility. Hillman distinguished between soul and psyche, using soul to refer to the depth and imaginal dimension, and psyche to refer to the interiority that modern psychology had created. This interiority, this sense of having a private inner world, was not a universal human experience but a modern Western construction. By focusing endlessly on one's inner world, one neglected the outer world, the city, the community, the environment, the body politic. Hillman called for a psychology that moved outward, that engaged with the world's soul, the anima mundi. The world itself has soul, the city has soul, buildings and streets and rivers have soul. We have impoverished our world by projecting all soul inward, making it a private possession. We need to recognize soul in the world to engage with the imaginal dimension of outer reality, not just of inner experience. This shift had implications for therapy. Instead of working on one's inner child or inner complexes, one might work on one's relationship to the city's beauty or ugliness, to the violence in the streets, to the degradation of the environment. Instead of dream analysis, one might practice soul-making by attending to the images that buildings and neighborhoods and natural places evoke. Therapy would become less about healing individuals and more about developing imaginal consciousness that can see and engage with the world's soul. This outward turn was partly motivated by Hillman's frustration with therapy culture. After decades of therapy, he asked, "Are we happier? Are we wiser? Is the world better? If not, then perhaps we have been looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps the focus on individual interior work has been a costly distraction from the collective work that needs to be done, political, cultural, environmental." Jung might have sympathized with this critique while maintaining his own emphasis. Yes, the outer world matters, but outer work without inner work is shallow activism that does not address the archetypal roots of collective problems. Without individual transformation, collective efforts simply replicate the same patterns at a different level. The shadow does not disappear because we work on social justice. It simply finds new forms of expression. This difference between Jung and Hillman reflects a broader tension in depth psychology and in progressive thought generally. The relationship between individual and collective change, between inner and outer work, between psychological and political transformation. Is consciousness primary, or are material conditions? Does the psyche shape culture, or does culture shape the psyche? The answer, surely, is both, but Jung and Hillman emphasize different directions. Perhaps the deepest source of their divergence lies in their different experiences of the 20th century. Jung lived through both world wars, witnessed the rise of totalitarianism, saw mass movements sweep away individual conscience. His response was to emphasize the individual's relationship to the self, the importance of individual consciousness as a bulwark against mass possession. He had seen what happened when individuals lost their centers, when they were swept up in collective movements, and he wanted to provide a psychological foundation for individual integrity. Hillman came of age after World War II, in the era of the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, the environmental movement. He saw a different problem, not mass possession by collective movements, but mass disconnection, atomization, the loss of community and collective meaning. His response was to emphasize multiplicity, community among the gods, the anima mundi as a shared imaginal space. Where Jung feared collective possession, Hillman feared individual isolation. Both fears are legitimate, and the tensions between their psychologies reflect the genuine complexity of being human in collective life. We need both individual centers and communal connection, both ego strength and ego flexibility, both unity and multiplicity. Jung and Hillman each articulated one pole of this tension, and their dialogue, whether they were actually conversing or we are imaginatively bringing them into conversation, helps us think more deeply about these enduring questions. As we move toward the completion of this night's exploration, let us consider what their combined legacy offers to those seeking to understand the depths of psyche and soul. From Jung, we inherit a comprehensive vision of the psyche as a vast territory containing both personal and collective dimensions, structured by archetypes oriented toward wholeness. We inherit methods for engaging this depth: active imagination, dream amplification, the study of symbols and myths. We inherit the concept of individuation as a lifelong journey toward becoming more fully oneself, a process that requires differentiation and integration, separation and reconnection. Jung gives us a map of the psyche, incomplete and always requiring revision, but nonetheless a map for those who feel lost in the chaos of psychological life, who sense depths within but have no language for them, who seek meaning and purpose. Jung provides a framework, a vocabulary, a set of practices. His work offers hope that suffering can be meaningful, that symptoms point towards something, that there is a center toward which we can orient even if we never fully reach it. From Hillman, we inherit a radical openness to multiplicity, a commitment to the image as primary, a resistance to premature unity. We inherit a suspicion of psychological monotheism, of the tyranny of the self, of developmental narratives that impose single paths, we inherit an invitation to stay with pathology, to honor depression and anxiety and confusion as voices of soul, to resist the therapeutic urge to fix and cure. We inherit a call to extend soul beyond the individual interior, to recognize anima mundi, soul in world. Hillman gives us not a map but a practice, a way of being with images, a mode of attention. For those who feel constrained by systems, who sense that the multiplicity within cannot be unified, who seek depth over coherence, Hillman provides permission, validation, an alternative vision. His work challenges hope of final answers, of achieved wholeness, but it offers something else, an ongoing conversation with soul, a deepening that has no end, a practice of imagination that enriches life even without promising cure. The question, which one is right, misses the point. They are right about different things, right in different registers, right for different moments of soul. There are times in life when Jung's vision is needed, when we feel fragmented and need a sense of center, when we seek meaning and purpose, when we need to hear that our suffering serves a developmental process, when we need the hope of wholeness. In those times, the self is not just a concept, but a lived reality, a presence that guides and organizes. And individuation is not just a theory, but a felt path. There are other times when Hillman's vision is needed, when Jung's framework feels too tight, when the emphasis on wholeness feels like a demand we cannot meet, when our multiplicity needs to be honored rather than integrated, when staying with darkness feels more honest than seeking light. In those times, polytheistic psychology is not just an interesting theory, but a necessary perspective. And sticking with the image is not just a method, but a way of respecting soul's autonomy. Perhaps maturity involves moving between these perspectives as needed, recognizing that we contain both the need for unity and the reality of multiplicity, both the self and the gods, both individuation and soul-making. This is not relativism, not a wishy-washy everything is true, but a recognition that psyche is complex enough to require multiple frameworks, multiple languages, multiple approaches. Consider how this plays out in understanding suffering. When someone is in deep depression, a Jungian approach might help them see this as a dark night of the soul, a descent that precedes transformation, a call from the unconscious to change their conscious attitude. This can be enormously helpful, providing meaning, hope, a sense of direction. It transforms senseless suffering into meaningful ordeal. But for the same person at a different moment, or for someone else in a different kind of depression, Hillman's approach might be more helpful. Instead of looking for meaning or direction, instead of treating the depression as a stage to be passed through, they might need to simply be with the depression to honor Hades, to discover what the underworld has to teach without trying to bring underworld wisdom up to daylight. This transforms depression from a problem to be solved into a place to inhabit, a perspective to honor. Both approaches value depth. Both refuse to treat depression as mere neurochemical imbalance. Both offer alternatives to the purely medical model. But they do different things, serve different needs, resonate with different souls. The richness of the Jungian-Hillman dialogue lies precisely in this difference, in the space between their perspectives. We might think of Jung and Hillman as representing two fundamental orientations of consciousness. Jung represents the integrative drive, the impulse toward coherence, unity, meaning, wholeness. This is a deep human need, reflected in every culture's creation myths, cosmologies, theologies. We need to feel that life has meaning, that we are going somewhere, that our experiences add up to something. Jung's psychology serves this need at a deep level, providing a framework within which everything, every dream, every symptom, every crisis can be understood as part of a larger, meaningful process. Hillman represents the differentiating drive, the impulse toward multiplicity, complexity, particularity, resistance to unity. This, too, is a deep human need, reflected in our actual experience of being torn between competing desires, of containing contradictory impulses, of seeing multiple perspectives. We need to honor our multiplicity, to resist premature closure, to let things be complex. Hillman's psychology serves this need, providing permission to not have it all together, to honor conflicting voices, to resist the pressure to integrate and unify. These two drives, integration and differentiation, are both essential to psychological life. Too much integration and we lose the richness of multiplicity. We impose false unities. We become rigid. Too much differentiation and we lose coherence. We cannot act decisively. We fragment. Health involves moving between them, sometimes gathering toward a center, sometimes dispersing toward multiplicity. In this sense, Jung and Hillman need each other. Jung without Hillman risks monotheism, rigidity, an authoritarian self. Hillman without Jung risks fragmentation, paralysis, the loss of any organizing principle. Together, they create a creative tension, a dialectic that is more useful than either position alone. This is not a Hegelian synthesis that would transcend both positions, but rather an ongoing oscillation between them, honoring now one and now the other. This oscillation might itself be understood archetypally. Jung represents Apollo light, consciousness, order, integration, the solar hero's journey toward enlightenment. Hillman represents Dionysus' darkness, multiplicity, ecstasy, dissolution, the descent into fragmentation and madness. Greek. Culture honored both gods, built temples to both, recognized that human life required both perspectives. The Apollonian impulse wants to see clearly, to understand, to organize, to rise above chaos. The Dionysian impulse wants to merge, to dissolve boundaries, to descend into primal unity that is also primal multiplicity, to lose oneself. Both are necessary. A purely Apollonian psychology would be sterile, disconnected from the body and from passion. A purely Dionysian psychology would be chaotic, unable to reflect, unable to create stable structures. Jung's emphasis on the self, on consciousness, on symbolic understanding is fundamentally Apollonian. Even though Jung himself was aware of the Dionysian dimension and wrote about it, Hillman's emphasis on multiplicity, on the body, on sticking with the dark image is fundamentally Dionysian, even though Hillman was highly intellectual and articulate, qualities that belong to Apollo. Their dialogue, then, enacts an archetypal tension, a conversation between gods. This is why their conversation continues to be fruitful, why each new generation of psychologists and therapists and seekers finds something valuable in exploring their similarities and differences. They are not just two theorists who disagreed on some points. They represent two fundamental ways of being with psyche, two orientations that every human being must navigate. As the night deepens and we prepare to release you into sleep, consider how this dialogue lives in you. Which pulls you more strongly, the Jungian impulse toward meaning and wholeness, or the Hillmanesque impulse toward multiplicity and sticking with the image? When you encounter a difficult emotion or a confusing dream, do you immediately want to understand what it means to fit it into a developmental narrative? Or do you prefer to stay with the confusion, to let the image remain in its complexity? There is no right answer. Different people have different temperaments, different needs. Some souls need Jung's structured journey toward the self. Other souls need Hillman's permission to remain multiple, to resist unity. Most of us need both at different times, and learning to recognize which we need when is part of psychological maturity. The conversation between Jung and Hillman teaches us that depth psychology is not a single thing, not a finished system, but an ongoing dialogue. It teaches us that the psyche is vast enough to require multiple approaches, mysterious enough to resist final understanding. It teaches us humility. Neither Jung nor Hillman nor anyone else has the complete picture, and pretending otherwise is a betrayal of the very depth we are trying to honor. This humility does not mean relativism or vagueness. Jung developed a powerful, coherent vision, and so did Hillman. Both deserve to be understood in their fullness, in their rigor, in their revolutionary insights. But understanding each in their fullness makes us aware of what each does, not cover, of the blind spots inherent in any perspective, of the need for multiple voices. In this way, the Jung-Hillman dialogue models what depth psychology should be. Not a dogma to be accepted, not a technique to be applied, but an ongoing conversation among different perspectives, each illuminating something true about the inexhaustible mystery of psyche. We inherit not answers, but questions, not solutions, but provocations to think more deeply, to see more clearly, to engage more fully with the imaginal dimension of reality. As you drift into sleep, let the tensions between these two visions soften. You need not choose between them. You can carry both, draw on both. Let each speak when it needs to speak. The part of you that seeks meaning and development can be honored. The part of you that resists unity and wants to stay with the dark complexity can also be honored. These are not contradictions to be resolved, but voices in the ongoing conversation that constitutes your psychological life. Dream tonight of a temple with two altars, one dedicated to the self, radiating mandala patterns of wholeness, the other dedicated to the many gods, each in their own niche, none supreme. Walk between them, honor both, recognize that soul needs both the promise of unity and the reality of multiplicity. Let images arise without rushing to interpret them. Let them remain in their mystery, in their autonomy, in their power. And remember that Jung and Hillman, for all their differences, agreed on what matters most, that the psyche is real, that images are primary, that depth exists, that soul must be honored, that the modern world has lost something essential that only the recovery of imaginal consciousness can restore. They are allies in the larger battle against literalism, materialism, superficiality, the flattening of experience into mere data or behavior. In honoring their dialogue, we honor the complexity of soul, the irreducibility of psyche, the ongoing mystery of what it means to be human. We acknowledge that we do not have final answers, that the work of understanding ourselves is never complete, that new images and new questions continue to arise. This is not a source of despair, but of richness, not a problem, but a gift. So, rest now, wanderer of the imaginal realms. Let Jung's voice speak of the self that awaits at the center of your being, the wholeness that calls you forward. Let Hillman's voice speak of the many gods who inhabit you, the multiplicity that cannot and should not be unified. Let both voices weave together in the tapestry of your dreaming, creating patterns more complex and beautiful than either alone could create. The night is deep, and the conversation between these two great souls continues in the silence, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the realm where all the dead and all the living meet, in the imaginal dimension that Jung and Hillman both devoted their lives to exploring and honoring. As you enter that realm now, carry with you the gift of their dialogue, the recognition that psyche is vast enough for multiple truths, deep enough to reward endless exploration, mysterious enough to remain forever beyond complete understanding. Sleep well, dream deep, and may the images that come teach you what you need to know, whether that be the unifying symbols of the self or the irreducible multiplicity of the gods. In the morning, you will wake to the daylight world of time and tasks, but some part of you will remember this night's journey through the territories where Jung and Hillman walk still, continuing their eternal dialogue about the nature of soul, and that remembering will change how you see, how you think, how you live with the depths that stir within. Good night, traveler. The conversation continues, always continues, between the one and the many, between unity and multiplicity, between Jung and Hillman, between all the voices that speak the mystery of psyche. Rest in that conversation. Let it carry you into dream, and know that when you wake, the dialogue will still be there, waiting for you to join it, to add your voice, to continue the exploration that has no end, because soul itself has no end, only endless depth, endless image, endless discovery. The silence gathers now. The words fade. The images remain, dancing in the darkness behind your closed eyes, neither unified nor chaotic, but simply present, alive, inviting you deeper into the mystery they embody. Go there now. Descend and dream.